The night I am going to tell you about, I was standing at the fence with my hands at my sides and I could not move. Not from fear. I want to be clear about that because fear is the word people reach for and it is the wrong word entirely. What I felt was closer to recognition, the way you feel when you walk into a room and something in it tells you that you have been expected. Rudy sat down beside my left boot and did not make a sound. The last light was coming through the hemlocks at a low angle, the kind of October dusk that turns everything the color of old brass. And along the top rail of the fence, in the exact pattern Della had always used, someone had placed 11 halved apples, cut side up, arranged in the same small, alternating clusters she had arranged them in for 22 years. I had not halved those apples. I had not placed them there. And I had not told a single living person about the pattern she used. If you want to understand what that moment meant, I need to go back to the week those apples were left in the shed. I spent 31 years as a backcountry ranger in the Blue Ridge District. Not the visitor center end of the work, not the trail crew end. The mapping and monitoring side, the part that required you to walk the same terrain in every season until you understood it, the way you understand a tool you have used for decades, by the weight of it, by the way it resists, by the small sounds it makes under specific conditions. I kept field notes the entire time. Observation logs, incident reports, wildlife census tallies, weather anomaly records. When I retired at 62, there were 31 years of those notes filed in the district office, organized by year and by drainage. I am a methodical person. I do not omit things because they are inconvenient. I do not shape evidence toward a conclusion I prefer. There is one note I have never filed. It is written in the same field notebook I carried that October. It sits in the drawer of the nightstand on Della's side of the bed, which is still her side even now. Della died 2.5 years before that October. Stroke, early autumn, a Tuesday morning, faster than the word fast can carry. She had been watching the deer from the kitchen window, and then she was not watching anything anymore. The kettle was on. There was half a piece of toast at the corner of her plate. The coffee in her cup had gone cold by the time the ambulance came, and I remember, in a useless and very precise way, noticing that the cold had moved up the side of the cup in a way that means it has been sitting that long, and that the morning had already passed without my knowing it. We had 42 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills, mixed timber and old pasture, and the deer had used the fence line along the north pasture for as long as we had owned the place. Della started the feeding ritual the second autumn we were there. Dried corn and apple halves, set along the top rail of the split rail fence at dusk, when the deer came out of the hemlocks into the last light. She had a particular arrangement she favoured, apple halves in pairs with one single half between each pair, the corn scattered in the flat spaces between. She never explained why she did it that way. I asked her once and she said it looked better balanced, and that was the end of the discussion. I kept the ritual after she was gone. I want to be honest about why. It was not a considered decision. It was not something I chose in the way you choose to honor a person. It was simply what happened when dusk came. My body walked to the shed, took down the corn sack from the second shelf, took the apples from the bowl on the counter, halved them on the cutting board with the same knife she had always used, carried them out to the fence. The muscle of it. The handle of the knife had a faint, dark stain at the heel where her thumb had rested across thousands of small kitchen tasks, and I noticed that stain every time I picked the knife up, and I never moved my own grip to avoid it. Rudy would follow me out and sit at the near post while I worked down the rail, and then we would both stand there a little while after, watching the field go grey. The smell of the cut apples carried on the cold air, sweet at first, and then a thinner, drier sweetness as the cut sides dried in the wind, and beneath it, the warm, dusty smell of the corn sack. And beneath that, the smell of the property itself, the cedar of the fence rails and the damp leaf litter, and the faint resin of the hemlocks at the north edge. The deer still came. Not every night, but often enough. 4 does in late October, a young buck in November who had no idea yet how visible he was. Della would have loved him. I stood at the fence looking at him, and I thought she would have loved him. And then I went inside. That was the 3rd autumn without her. The routine had calcified the way routines do when there is no one to interrupt them. I drove to Haney's Hardware in Alderton on Saturdays for whatever the place needed. I made enough coffee each morning and poured most of it out. I walked the perimeter of the 42 acres on Tuesday afternoons, with Rudy working the scent lines ahead of me, and I stood at the fence each dusk. The kitchen felt too large. I had stopped putting 2 cups on the counter in the mornings without deciding to stop. Owen called occasionally, maybe once every 6 weeks, and I answered and we talked about his work and about the weather and about nothing that mattered. And after we hung up, the house was quieter than it had been before he called. That is the arithmetic of those months. A subtraction that did not announce itself, but kept running. I need to tell you something before I go further. I am not a person who gives easy explanations the benefit of the doubt. 31 years of field observation trains you to distrust your first interpretation of anything. You see a track and you identify the animal, then you look for the secondary evidence that confirms or contradicts. You hear a sound in the timber, and you let it repeat before you record it. You do not file what you cannot support. That discipline is the reason I can tell you what I am going to tell you and ask you to take it seriously. If you think I imagined what happened, I understand. I would have thought the same thing about anyone else who told me this story. The first thing I noticed was the corn. It was the 2nd week of October, a Monday. I had set out the corn the evening before in the usual way, scattered loosely between the apple halves along the 11 fence posts. When I came out at first light with Rudy, the corn was different. It had been arranged. Moved from the flat scatter I had left into small, distinct piles, 4 or 5 kernels each, placed at regular intervals along the rail. Not blown there, the night had been still, and the spacing was too precise for wind. Not pushed there by deer. Deer do not sort corn into evenly spaced clusters on a narrow rail with their noses. My first explanation was a raccoon with unusual habits. I have seen raccoons do peculiar things with food, sorting by texture, arranging pieces by some preference I could not decode. I held that explanation for most of the day. By mid-morning, it had started to feel thin. The spacing between piles was too consistent. 6 inches, give or take, post to post. A raccoon working in the dark does not maintain 6-inch intervals for 11 fence posts. I let it go. I noted it in the field book out of habit and said nothing to anyone. The second thing happened 4 days later. Della had kept a bird-watching journal for the last 8 years of her life. A green cloth-covered book, smaller than my field notebooks. Her handwriting inside in a blue pen she favoured. After she died, I put it in the small shed off the back porch where I keep the seed and the corn sack, and the old tools I cannot bring myself to sell. I put it on the shelf above the corn because I did not know what else to do with it, and I could not look at it, and I could not throw it away. It had been there for 2.5 years. I knew exactly where it was. I had not touched it. That Friday morning I went to the shed for the corn sack, and the journal was on the porch step, open. Laid open to a page near the back, the 2 pages showing a list of birds she had spotted from the north pasture in the first week of November, 3 years before she died. Her handwriting, her blue pen, the little margin sketches she made of wing shapes. I stood there with the corn sack in my hand and looked at it for what might have been 30 seconds. The shed door was latched. I remember latching it the evening before. My second explanation was that I had taken the journal out myself at some point and simply forgotten. I'm 64 years old and I live alone and memory gaps happen. I held that explanation for about 20 minutes, long enough to carry the corn out to the fence and scatter it, and stand there with Rudy while the light came up. Then I let it go too, because I knew the difference between a thing I had forgotten doing and a thing I had not done. I had not touched that journal since I put it on the shelf. I went back to the porch and sat on the step beside the open journal for a while. I did not pick it up. I looked at her handwriting, the careful column of bird names, and I thought, well, Della, you always had better field observation skills than I did. Then I picked it up and carried it inside and put it on the kitchen table, and that evening I read every page of it before I went to bed. Rudy had been behaving differently at the fence for those same 4 days. Not alarmed differently, not hackles up and bark differently. Interested. He would finish sniffing the fence posts in his usual pattern, and then turn and face the tree line and sit. Not his alert posture, which I knew from years of walking with him, the stiffness across the shoulders, the tucked tail, his calm posture, the way he sat when he had located something worth attending to and decided it posed no concern. He is an old dog, 9 years, which is old for a blue tick. He does not sit still without reason. I watched him do it 3 evenings in a row. Each time he sat facing the hemlock edge and held it for 5 or 10 minutes, before turning back to me and heading for the porch. On the 3rd evening, I watched the tree line instead of watching him. The light was almost gone, that narrow last 10 minutes of visible colour before the dark settles fully. The hemlocks ran along the north edge of the property in a dense line, and beyond them, the ground dropped into a hollow I knew well. A seasonal drainage with a small spring at the bottom. In 31 years of walking that drainage, I had documented black bear, bobcat, white-tailed deer, turkey, coyote, and once, in the early years, a pair of otters that had no business being that far from moving water. I knew what the timber at that edge looked like at every hour and in every season. I knew it well enough to know when something was different. Something was different. There was a shape at the tree line that did not belong to the trees. It was set back, maybe 30 feet into the timber, and the light was nearly gone. So I cannot give you the kind of detail I could give you in full daylight. What I can tell you is that it was tall, taller than any bear posture I have observed, and I have observed a good many. Bears at the tree edge are wide and low-centered, even when they stand. This was narrow at the shoulders relative to its height, and it was still in the way that large things are still when they have chosen to be still on purpose. It did not shift its weight. It did not turn its head. It was simply present in the way a person stands when they are watching something they have been watching for a while. Rudy did not growl. He looked from me to the tree line and back again, and then he stood up and walked to the porch steps and lay down. As if the question had been asked and the answer was nothing to worry about. I stood at the fence for another few minutes. The shape, whatever it was, remained where it was. Then the last light went, and I could not see the timber anymore, only the dark where it had been. I went inside. I noted the sighting in the field book. Height estimated at 8 feet or better. Bipedal posture at rest. Zero threat behavior. Approximate location 30 feet inside the north hemlock line. I wrote it the way I would write any field observation. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without writing anything else. I want to be honest with you. I had been a ranger long enough to have heard the stories. Every district has them, passed between crews at the fire stations or at the trailheads, stories that nobody puts in their official reports. I had always been polite when those stories came up. I had not believed them. The discipline of 31 years had not allowed for that category of thing. What I had just seen did not fit any other category I had. The next 2 days were ordinary in the surface way that days can be ordinary when something is pressing through the underside of them. I went to Haney's on the Saturday for a box of weather stripping and a new pull cord for the shed lamp. Carl Haney was behind the counter as he had been for 30 years, and we talked about the weather turning and about the deer numbers this season, and I paid for my things and left. I drove past the overlook on Route 9 where Della and I used to stop on drives, and I did not stop. I had stopped stopping there sometime in the first year and never taken it up again. Small avoidances accumulate without your noticing, the way the debt of them does. That Sunday evening I carried the corn and the apples out to the fence as usual. The light was coming through the hemlocks at that same low October angle, everything going copper and quiet. I had halved the apples in the kitchen and carried them out in Della's blue ceramic bowl, the one she always used. 11 posts, 11 spaces on the rail. I worked down from the first post toward the far end, placing the pears as she had always placed them. One single between each pair, the corn in the flat spaces. Rudy followed me and sat at the near post, and I was almost at the far end when he stood up. Not alarmed, not barking. He stood and turned toward the tree line, and his tail moved once, slow, the way it moved when he greeted someone he knew. I looked up. It was at the edge of the hemlocks, not 30 feet in this time. At the edge, where the last light was still reaching, where I could see it clearly. I have been trying to find accurate language for this for a year now, and I'm going to give you the plainest version I have. It was very large. 8 feet, possibly more, the shoulders wider than I had estimated from the distance of 2 nights before. Dark, the colour of old bark, covered in something I can only call fur for lack of a better word. It was standing at the tree line and it was looking at me. Not at Rudy, at me. The posture was direct, but it was not aggressive. There is a particular quality of stillness that a large animal carries when it intends threat, a coiled quality, and this had none of that. It stood the way a person stands when they have something to give and are waiting to see if you will come close enough to receive it. I did not move. I could not have told you at that moment whether my inability to move was physical or something else. And then it did something. It moved along the tree line, not toward me, parallel, working toward the far end of the fence. Deliberate, unhurried, each step placed with a care that seemed too considered for the size of the thing. It reached the far end of the fence, the 11th post, and it crouched there at the tree line's edge. And it was in that moment, watching it crouch, that I understood something had been placed there. A pile of something at the base of that post, something I had not seen when I worked down the rail with the apples, because my eyes had been on the rail, not the ground. My feet moved before I knew they were going to. I walked to the far post. Rudy walked with me, easy, unhurried, and I looked at what was there. Apples, halved. The cuts were clean, the kind of cut you make with a sharp knife on a board, not torn or bitten. 11 halves arranged along the base of the fence in the same alternating pattern Della had always used on the rail. Pairs with a single between each pair. The same spacing, the same orientation, cut side up, catching the last copper of the light. I stood there and I understood that this had been watched, that this ritual, this specific arrangement, had been observed over time, over more than one season, and that the thing crouching at the tree line's edge had learned it and reproduced it and placed it there for me to find. The cuts on the apples had been made with something blunt and patient, not torn but parted, the flesh of them clean and faintly damp where it caught the last copper light. I picked up one of the halves and turned it in my hand. It was cold. It smelled of fresh apple and of something else, the same green cold smell that comes out of a hemlock thicket on a damp morning. And the smell of the second thing was faint, but it was there. I do not know what it intended. I have thought about that question for a year, and I have no answer I trust. What I know is what it felt like to stand at that fence post and look at those apples arranged in the pattern my wife had made her own, and feel something in my chest come loose that had been set hard for 2.5 years. I did not cry. I am telling you exactly what happened, and that is what happened. I stood there and something released in me without my permission, the way a knot releases when the tension that made it has finally gone. I felt it in my throat and behind my eyes and in my hands, which were shaking slightly. I had not known they were shaking until I noticed them. I looked up. The creature was still at the tree line's edge. The light was nearly gone. For one moment I could see its eyes, pale in the failing light, steady, and they were looking at me with something I cannot categorize and am not going to pretend to categorize. I have been a careful observer for my entire working life. I know what I saw, and I know the limits of what I can interpret from it. What I saw was attention, patient, unhurried attention, the kind you give something you have been watching for a long time. Then it turned and walked back into the hemlocks and was gone. There was no break of branches. There was no rustle of needle litter. The dark inside the timber simply closed around the place where it had been, the way it would close around any animal that knew the woods well enough to belong to them. Rudy sat down beside my boot. The field was entirely grey now. Somewhere in the timber a barred owl called, and then did not call again, and the silence that came after it was different from the silence before. Softer, maybe. I am not sure silence has a texture, but that is the only word I have for it. I could feel the cold on the back of my neck and the small, steady warmth of Rudy's flank against my shin and the weight of the empty bowl in my left hand. And none of those small, accurate sensations added up to anything I had a category for. I stood there for a while. I do not know how long. Long enough for the first stars to show above the timber. I went inside and set Della's blue bowl on the counter. I sat at the kitchen table. The field notebook was there from earlier. I opened it to a new page and I wrote down what I had seen, exactly as I have described it to you, in the same format I used for 31 years of field observations. Location, time, light conditions, behavioral description, duration of sighting. I wrote it all out and then I put the pen down and sat there. I picked up the phone. Owen answered on the third ring. He sounded cautious the way he always did now when my name appeared on his screen, that half-second pause before his voice came on that told me he was bracing for something or for nothing, which might have been worse. He said, "Dad, the way you say a word when you have been waiting for it to mean something again, and you are not sure it does yet." I said, "Hey." He said, "Hey, everything okay?" I said, "Yeah." And then I said, "No, I don't know." And then I said, "I think I need to talk." There was a pause, not the cautious kind, the kind where someone is adjusting what they were prepared for. He said, "Okay." I said, "I'm sorry about the last couple of years, the quiet. I know what it felt like on your end." He said, "Dad." I said, "I'm not saying it right. I've been sitting here trying to find the right way, and there isn't one, so I'm just going to say it wasn't your fault, and I know it didn't feel that way." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's okay." I said, "It's not, but thank you." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. He said, "What happened?" I said, "Something. Out at the fence. I'll tell you about it when I can figure out how." He said, "Okay." And then, "Do you want me to come up?" I had not expected that. The offer landed somewhere in the middle of me, and I sat with it for a few seconds before I answered. I said, "Maybe, yeah, maybe in the spring if you can manage it." He said, "I'll manage it." We talked for 40 minutes, about Della, which we had not done in longer than I want to admit, about the property, about what needed work before winter, about nothing in particular in a way that felt like something in particular. When we hung up, I sat at the table for a while longer. The house did not feel smaller. That is the only way I know to say it. The walls had been the same walls they always were, but the space inside them felt proportionate again, as if the rooms had been reset to the size they were when there were two of us, and enough of me had come back to fill my part of it. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the apples, about the pattern, about what it meant that something had watched that ritual long enough to learn it. I thought about Della and the deer and the years of dusk at the fence. I thought about patience, the particular kind of patience that watches without announcing itself, that notices without requiring acknowledgement. At some point, I stopped thinking and just lay there, and that was enough. I went to Haney's the following Saturday as usual. Carl was behind the counter, and we talked about the weather, and he asked how I was doing in the way that people ask when they have been asking for 2.5 years and are not sure they will ever get a different answer. I told him I was doing better. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Good." He meant it. I bought a new hinge for the shed door and a bag of dried corn and drove home. I still do not know what was in those woods. I want to be clear about that. I have the field note, and I have my own memory of what I observed, and I have the evidence of the apples, which I photographed the next morning in full daylight before I touched them. 11 halves cut side up in Della's arrangement. I have had a year to consider alternative explanations, and I have not found one that holds. I have not filed that field note. I will not file it. Not because I doubt what I saw, but because there is no category in any form I have ever completed that would receive it honestly, and I spent 31 years filing only what I could support. What I believe, insofar as a careful person can say that word. Something had been at the edge of this property for more than one season. It had watched the ritual at the fence. It had watched long enough to understand the pattern, the specific arrangement of halved apples that Della had made her habit. And on an October evening, when the man who was keeping that ritual alone had been doing so for 2.5 years, it placed those apples in her pattern at the base of the fence post and waited to see if he would find them. Why? I cannot tell you why. I have no access to that. I only know what was done and what it felt like to receive it. I have considered more than once that what I am calling watching is not the right verb. Whatever was on the other side of those hemlocks may not watch in any way I could call by that name. It may attend the way a long, quiet thing attends to the small living habits of a place it considers its own. It may register. I do not know what verb is correct. I know I felt it. Owen came in April. He drove up on a Friday afternoon with his dog, a young shepherd mix named Bix, who immediately challenged Rudy's authority over every threshold in the house, and then deferred entirely, because Rudy has always known how to wait out a young dog's enthusiasm. Owen looked older than I had been carrying him in my head. His face had the kind of settling that happens to a man in his 30s, when he has had a hard couple of years, and not been given the room to put them down. We hugged at the door and held the hug a beat longer than either of us would have a year before, and that was as much language as we needed for the first minute. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, and I told Owen about the autumn, about the corn arrangement and the journal on the porch step and what I had seen at the tree line. I told it the same way I have told it to you, plainly and in order, without embellishment, and he listened the way I have rarely seen him listen to anything I said. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. He said, "Did it scare you?" I said, "No." He said, "What did it feel like?" I said, like being seen by something that had been paying attention for a long time. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I know that feeling." I understood what he meant. We sat there with that for a little while, the two of us at the table where the three of us used to sit, and it was painful the way honest things sometimes are, and it was also all right. More all right than any conversation we had managed in the previous 2 years. He asked if he could walk the fence line before he left on Sunday. I said yes. We walked it on Sunday morning, Rudy and Bix ahead of us, the frost still on the ground in the shadows of the hemlocks, the field just beginning to show the first pale colour of spring coming. Owen stopped at the 11th post and looked at the tree line for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You going to keep doing it? The apples and the corn?" I said yes. He said, "Good." That was enough. That was exactly the right amount. I have thought about what to do with the field note. I considered sending it to the district office with a cover letter. I considered filing it with one of the wildlife research programs at the state university. I considered throwing it away. I have done none of those things. It is in the drawer on Della's side of the nightstand, and that is where it will stay. She would have known what to make of it better than I do. She always had a larger idea of what the world was allowed to contain, and I was always the one who needed proof before I would extend the category. She did not hold that against me. I am aware at 64 that she was correct about more things than I acknowledged while she was here. The fence is still standing. I replaced 2 posts this past summer, the ones closest to the hemlock line that had gone soft at the base. Cut new posts from a red cedar that came down in a July windstorm, set them in with 80 pounds of dry concrete each. Solid work, the kind that holds. I found myself humming while I worked, which I had not done in longer than I could place. I still set the corn and the apples at dusk each evening when the season is right. I still halve them on the cutting board in the kitchen with the knife she always used, still carry them out in the blue ceramic bowl. I still set them in her arrangement along the 11 posts, pairs with a single between each pair, cut side up. The deer still come, the does, and occasional bucks taking their time with the offering in the last light, the way they always have. I have not seen the shape at the tree line again. I am not waiting to see it. That is a different posture than the one I was in before October, though it is hard to describe the difference in plain terms. The waiting I was doing before was the closed kind, the kind where you are facing away from everything because nothing outside of a particular absence seems worth facing. The posture I have now is different. Open, maybe. Willing, at least. I want to tell you about the last thing I noticed. It was 3 weeks after the encounter, late October, the first real frost of the year. I went out in the morning and the frost had caught every surface. Fence rails, dead grass, the cedar boards of the shed, all of it white and precise in the early light. The air smelled of cold metal and wood smoke from somewhere down the hollow, and the field had that particular stillness that the first frost brings, the kind of stillness that feels like the property has decided about something. Overnight. Rudy came out behind me. He did not go to the fence. He went to the near post, the first one, and sat down and faced the tree line the way he had been doing all that autumn. I stood on the porch and watched him. He sat there for 5 minutes, easy, his grey muzzle up, reading whatever the air was carrying to him. Then he stood, satisfied, and came back to the porch and pressed his side against my leg. I do not know what he found in that air. I know what I think he found. I cannot support it any better than I can support what I wrote in the field note. And the field note has been in the drawer for a year now, and I have made my peace with supporting it exactly as much as I can support it, which is, I was there, I am a careful observer, and this is what I observed. Patience, it turns out, is something that can be given back to you after you have spent it down to nothing. I did not know that. I know it now. The drawer on Della's side of the nightstand is still hers. The field note is inside it, written in my handwriting on green-covered paper, filed under the one system I trust, without reservation. Rudy sits at that first post each evening when I come out with the bowl, and we stand there together. And I put out what she left me with, and the deer take it, and the hemlocks hold whatever they are holding, and the night comes on the way it always has, reliable as the fence itself. I do not look for the shape at the tree line anymore. Some evenings the woods feel attended in a way I have come to recognize, and some evenings they feel only like woods, and I have stopped needing to know the difference, because the rituals do their work whether or not I can see what is receiving them. That is something I have learned in the slow way a careful person learns, and that I would not have been able to learn any other way. That is enough for me, here at 64, on this small piece of held ground.